You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon, and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Now presenting the Paris Peace Conference. The Paris Peace Conference was a set of formal and informal diplomatic meetings in 1919 and 1920, after the end of World War I, in which the victorious Allies set the peace terms for the defeated Central Powers. Dominated by the leaders of Britain, France, the United States, and Italy, the conference resulted in 5 treaties that rearranged the maps of Europe and parts of Asia, Africa, and the Pacific Islands, and also imposed financial penalties. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and the other losing nations were not given a voice in the deliberations. This later gave rise to political resentments that lasted for decades. The arrangements made by this conference are considered one of the great watersheds of 20th century geopolitical history. The conference involved diplomats from 32 countries and nationalities. Its major decisions were the creation of the League of Nations and the 5 peace treaties with the defeated states. Main arrangements agreed upon in the treaties were, among others, the transition of German and Ottoman overseas possessions as mandates from the hands of these countries chiefly into the hands of Britain and France, the imposition of reparations upon Germany, and the drawing of new national boundaries, sometimes involving plebiscites, to reflect ethnic boundaries more closely. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson in 1917 commissioned a group of about 150 academics to research topics likely to arise in diplomatic talks on the European stage, and to develop a set of principles to be used for the peace negotiations in order to end World War I. The results of this research were summarized in the so-called 14 Points document that became the basis for the terms of the German surrender during the conference, as it had earlier been the basis of the German government's negotiations in the armistice of 11th of November 1918. The main result of the conference was the Treaty of Versailles with Germany. Article 231 of that treaty placed the whole guilt for the war on the aggression of Germany and her allies. That provision proved very humiliating for German leaders, armies, and citizens alike, and set the stage for the expensive reparations that Germany was intended to pay, only a small portion of which had been delivered when it stopped paying after 1931. The 5 great powers at that time, France, Britain, Italy, Japan, and the United States, controlled the conference. The Big Four leaders were French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando. Together with teams of diplomats and jurists, they met informally 145 times and agreed upon all major decisions before they were ratified. The conference began on the 18th of January 1919. With respect to its end, Professor Michael Nyberg noted, although the senior statesmen stopped working personally on the conference in June 1919, the formal peace process did not really end until July 1923, when the Treaty of Lausanne was signed. The entire process is often referred to as the Versailles Conference. Although only the signing of the first treaty took place in the historic palace, the negotiations occurred at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris. Part 1. Overview and direct results. The conference formally opened on the 18th of January 1919 at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris. This date was symbolic, as it was the anniversary of the proclamation of William I as German Emperor in 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, shortly before the end of the Siege of Paris. A day itself imbued with significance in its turn in Germany as the anniversary of the establishment of the Kingdom of Prussia in 1701. The delegates from 27 nations, delegates representing 5 nationalities, were for the most part ignored, were assigned to 52 commissions, which held 1,646 sessions to prepare reports, with the help of many experts, on topics ranging from prisoners of war to undersea cables, to international aviation, to responsibility for the war. Key recommendations were folded into the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, which had 15 chapters and 440 clauses, as well as treaties for the other defeated nations. The 5 major powers, France, Britain, Italy, the U.S., and Japan, controlled the conference. Amongst the Big Five, In practice, Japan only sent a former prime minister and played a small role, and the Big Four leaders dominated the conference. The four met together informally 145 times and made all the major decisions, which in turn were ratified by other attendees. The open meetings of all the delegations approved the decisions made by the Big Four. The conference came to an end on the 21st of January 1920 with the inaugural General Assembly of the League of Nations. 5 major peace treaties were prepared at the Paris Peace Conference with, in parentheses, the affected countries. The Treaty of Versailles, 28th of June 1919, Germany. The Treaty of Saint-Germain, 10th of September 1919, Austria. The Treaty of Neuilly, 27th of November 1919, Bulgaria. The Treaty of Trianon, 4th of June 1920, Hungary. The Treaty of Sèvres, 10th of August 1920, subsequently revised by the Treaty of Lausanne, 24th of July 1923, Ottoman Empire, Republic of Turkey. The major decisions were the establishment of the League of Nations, the 5 peace treaties with defeated enemies, the awarding of German and Ottoman overseas possessions as mandates, chiefly to members of the British Empire and to France, reparations imposed on Germany, and the drawing of new national boundaries, sometimes with plebiscites, to better reflect the forces of nationalism. The main result was the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, which in Section 231 laid the guilt for the war on the aggression of Germany and her allies. This provision proved humiliating for Germany and set the stage for very high reparations. Germany was supposed to pay. It paid only a small portion before reparations ended in 1931. According to British historian A.J.P. Taylor, the treaty seemed to Germans wicked, unfair, and dictation a slave treaty, but one which they would repudiate at some stage if it did not fall to pieces of its own absurdity. As the conference's decisions were enacted unilaterally and largely on the whims of the Big Four, Paris was effectively the center of a world government during the conference, which deliberated over and implemented the sweeping changes to the political geography of Europe. Most famously, the Treaty of Versailles itself weakened the German military and placed full blame for the war and costly reparations on Germany's shoulders. And the later humiliation and resentment in Germany is often sometimes considered by historians to be one of the direct causes of Nazi Party's electoral successes and one of the indirect causes of World War II. The League of Nations proved controversial in the United States, since critics said it subverted the powers of the U.S. Congress to declare war. The U.S. Senate did not ratify any of the peace treaties, and so the United States never joined the League. Instead, the 1921 to 1923 Harding administration concluded new treaties with Germany, Austria, and Hungary. The German Weimar Republic was not invited to attend the conference at Versailles. Representatives of White Russia but not Communist Russia were at the conference. Numerous other nations sent delegations to appeal for various unsuccessful additions to the treaties, and parties lobbied for causes ranging from independence for the countries of the South Caucasus to Japan's unsuccessful proposal for racial equality to the other great powers. Mandates. A central issue of the conference was the disposition of the overseas colonies of Germany. Austria-Hungary did not have major colonies, and the Ottoman Empire was a separate issue. The British dominions wanted their reward for their sacrifice. Australia wanted New Guinea, New Zealand wanted Samoa, and South Africa wanted Southwest Africa. Wilson wanted the League to administer all German colonies until they were ready for independence. Lloyd George realized he needed to support his dominions, and so he proposed a compromise. There be 3 types of mandates. Mandates for the Turkish provinces were one category and would be divided up between Britain and France. The second category, of New Guinea, Samoa, and Southwest Africa, were located so close to responsible supervisors that the mandates could hardly be given to anyone except Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Finally, the African colonies would need the careful supervision as Class B mandates, which could be provided only by experienced colonial powers. Britain, France, and Belgium, although Italy and Portugal received small amounts of territory. Wilson and the others finally went along with the solution. The dominions received Class C mandates to the colonies that they wanted. Japan obtained mandates over German possessions north of the equator. Wilson wanted no mandates for the United States, but his main advisor, Colonel House, was deeply involved in awarding the others. Wilson was especially offended by Australian demands and had some memorable clashes with Hughes, the Australian Prime Minister, this the most famous. Wilson: "But after all, you speak for only 5 million people. I represent 60,000 dead." Part 3. British Approach. The maintenance of the unity, territories, and interests of the British Empire was an overarching concern for the British delegates to the conference, but they entered the conference with more specific goals with this order of priority: ensuring the security of France, removing the threat of the German High Seas Fleet, settling territorial contentions, supporting the League of Nations. The racial equality proposal put forth by the Japanese did not directly conflict with any core British interest, but as the conference progressed, its full implications on immigration to the British dominions, with Australia taking particular exception, became a major point of contention within the delegation. Ultimately, the British delegation did not treat that proposal as a fundamental aim of the conference. They were willing to sacrifice the racial equality proposal to placate the Australian delegation, and thus help to satisfy their own overarching aim of preserving the unity of the British Empire. Britain had reluctantly consented to the attendance of separate delegations from British dominions. But the British managed to rebuff attempts by the envoys of the newly proclaimed Irish Republic to put a case to the conference for Irish self-determination, diplomatic recognition, and membership in the proposed League of Nations. The Irish envoy's final demand for recognition in a letter to Clemenceau, the conference chairman, was not answered. Britain had been planning to renege on the Government of Ireland Act 1914, and instead to replace it with a new Government of Ireland Bill, which would partition Ireland into 2 Irish Home Rule states, which eventually was passed as the Government of Ireland Act 1920. The planned 2 states would both be within the United Kingdom, and so neither would have dominion status. David Lloyd George commented that he did not do badly at the peace conference, considering I was seated between Jesus Christ and Napoleon. This was a reference to the great idealism of Wilson, who desired merely to punish Germany, and the stark realism of Clemenceau, who was determined to see Germany effectively destroyed. Dominion representation. The Dominion governments were not originally given separate invitations to the conference, and had been expected to send representatives as part of the British delegation. Convinced that Canada had become a nation on the battlefields of Europe, Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden demanded that it have a separate seat at the conference. That was initially opposed not only by Britain, but also by the United States, which saw any Dominion delegation as an extra British vote. Borden responded by pointing out that since Canada had lost nearly 60,000 men, a far larger proportion of its men than the 50,000 American men lost, it had at least the right to the representation of a minor power. Lloyd George eventually relented and persuaded the reluctant Americans to accept the presence of delegations from Canada, India, Australia, Newfoundland, New Zealand, and South Africa, and that those countries receive their own seats in the League of Nations. Canada, despite its huge losses in the war, did not ask for either reparations or mandates. The Australian delegation, led by Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes, fought greatly for its demands: reparations, the annexation of German New Guinea, and the rejection of the racial equality proposal. He said that he had no objection to the proposal if it was stated in unambiguous terms that it did not confer any right to enter Australia. He was concerned by the increasing power of Japan. Within months of the declaration of war in 1914, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand had seized all of Germany's possessions in the Far East and the Pacific Ocean. The British had given their blessing for Japan to occupy German possessions, but Hughes was alarmed by that policy. Part 4. French Approach. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau controlled his delegation, and his chief goal was to weaken Germany militarily, strategically, and economically. Having personally witnessed 2 German attacks on French soil in the last 40 years, he was adamant for Germany not to be permitted to attack France again. Particularly, Clemenceau sought an American and British joint guarantee of French security in the event of another German attack. Clemenceau also expressed skepticism and frustration with Wilson's 14 points and complained, "Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Why, God Almighty has only 10. Wilson gained some favor by signing a mutual defense treaty with France, but he did not present it to his country's government for ratification, and so it never took effect. Another possible French policy was to seek a rapprochement with Germany. In May 1919, the diplomat René Massigli was sent on several secret missions to Berlin. During his visits, he offered, on behalf of his government, to revise the territorial and economic clauses of the upcoming peace treaty. Massigli spoke of the desirability of practical verbal discussions between French and German officials that would lead to a Franco-German collaboration. Furthermore, Massigli told the Germans that the French thought of the Anglo-Saxon powers, the United States and the British Empire, as the major threat to France in the post-war world. He argued that both France and Germany had a joint interest in opposing Anglo-Saxon domination of the world, and he warned that the deepening of opposition between the French and the Germans would lead to the ruin of both countries, to the advantage of the Anglo-Saxon powers. The Germans rejected Massigli's offers because they believed that the intention was to trick them into accepting the Treaty of Versailles unchanged. Also, the German foreign minister, Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, thought that the United States was more likely to reduce the severity of the penalties than France was. Lloyd George was the one who eventually pushed for better terms for Germany. Part 5: Italian Approach. In 1914, Italy remained neutral despite the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. In 1915, it joined the Allies to gain the territories promised by the Triple Entente in the secret Treaty of London: Trentino, the Tyrol as far as Brenner, Trieste, Istria, most of the Dalmatian coast, except Fiume, Valona, a protectorate over Albania, Antalya in Turkey, and possibly colonies in Africa. Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando tried to obtain full implementation of the Treaty of London, as agreed by France and Britain before the war. He had popular support because of the loss of 700,000 soldiers and a budget deficit of 12,000. Italian lire during the war made both the government and people feel entitled to all of those territories, and even others not mentioned in the Treaty of London. Particularly Fiume, which many Italians believed should be annexed to Italy because of the city's Italian population. Orlando, unable to speak English, conducted negotiations jointly with his foreign minister Sidney Sonnino, a Protestant of British origins who spoke the language. Together, they worked primarily to secure the partition of the Habsburg monarchy. At the conference, Italy gained Istria, Trieste, Trentino, and South Tyrol. Most of Dalmatia, however, was given to the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and Fiume remained disputed territory, causing a nationalist outrage. Orlando obtained other results, such as the permanent membership of Italy in the League of Nations and the promise by the Allies to transfer British Jubaland and the French Aouzou Strip to Italian colonies. Protectorates over Albania and Antalya were also recognized, but nationalists considered the war to be a mutilated victory, and Orlando was ultimately forced to abandon the conference and to resign. Francesco Saverio Nitti took his place and signed the treaties. There was a general disappointment in Italy, which the nationalists and fascists used to build the idea that Italy was betrayed by the Allies and refused what had been promised. That was a cause for the general rise of Italian fascism. Orlando refused to see the war as a mutilated victory and replied to nationalists calling for a greater expansion. Italy today is a great state, on par with the great historic and contemporary states. This is, for me, our main and principal expansion. Part 6: Japanese Approach. Japan sent a large delegation, headed by the former Prime Minister, Marquis Saionji Kinmochi. It was originally one of the Big Five, but relinquished that role because of its slight interest in European affairs. Instead, it focused on two demands: the inclusion of its racial equality proposal in the League's covenant and Japanese territorial claims with respect to former German colonies, Shantung, including Kiaochao, and the Pacific Islands north of the equator, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, the Mariana Islands, and the Carolines. The former Foreign Minister Baron Makino Nobuaki was de facto chief, and Saionji's role was symbolic and limited because of his history of ill health. The Japanese delegation became unhappy after it had received only half of the rights of Germany, and it then walked out of the conference. Racial Equality Proposal. During the negotiations, the leader of the Japanese delegation, Saionji Kinmochi, proposed the inclusion of a racial equality clause in the Covenant of the League of Nations on the 13th of February as an amendment to Article 21. The equality of nations being a basic principle of the League of Nations, the high contracting parties agreed to accord as soon as possible to all alien nationals of states, members of the League, equal and just treatment in every respect, making no distinction, either in law or in fact, on account of their race or nationality. The clause quickly proved problematic to both the American and British delegations. Though the proposal itself was compatible with Britain's stance of nominal equality for all British subjects as a principle for maintaining imperial unity, there were significant deviations in the stated interests of its dominions, notably Australia and South Africa. Though both dominions could not vote on the decision individually, they were strongly opposed to the clause and pressured Britain to do likewise. Ultimately, the British delegation succumbed to imperial pressure and abstained from voting for the clause. Meanwhile, though Wilson was indifferent to the clause, there was fierce resistance to it from the American public, and he ruled as conference chairman that a unanimous vote was required for the Japanese proposal to pass. Ultimately, on the day of the vote, only 11 of the 17 delegates voted in favor of the proposal. The defeat of the proposal influenced Japan's turn from cooperation with the Western world into more nationalist and militarist policies and approaches. Territorial claims. The Japanese claim to Shantung faced strong challenges from the Chinese Patriotic Student Group. In 1914, at the outset of the war, Japan had seized the territory that had been granted to Germany in 1897 and also seized the German islands in the Pacific north of the equator. In 1917, Japan had made secret agreements with Britain, France, and Italy to guarantee their annexation of these territories. With Britain, there was an agreement to support British annexation of the Pacific Islands south of the equator. Despite a generally pro-Chinese view by the American delegation, Article 156 of the Treaty of Versailles transferred German concessions in the Jiaozhou Bay, China, to Japan rather than returning sovereign authority to China. The leader of the Chinese delegation, Liu Zhengxiang, demanded a reservation be inserted before he would sign the treaty. After the reservation was denied, the treaty was signed by all the delegations except that of China. Chinese outrage over that provision led to demonstrations known as the May 4th movement. The Pacific Islands north of the equator became a Class C mandate administered by Japan. Part 7. American Approach. Until Wilson's arrival in Europe in December 1918, no sitting American president had ever visited the continent. Wilson's 1918 14 points had helped win many hearts and minds as the war ended, not only in America but all over Europe, including Germany, as well as its allies in and the former subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Wilson's diplomacy and his 14 points had essentially established the conditions for the armistices that had brought an end to World War I. Wilson felt it to be his duty and obligation to the people of the world to be a prominent figure at the peace negotiations. High hopes and expectations were placed on him to deliver what he had promised for the post-war era. In doing so, Wilson ultimately began to lead the foreign policy of the United States towards interventionism, a move that has been strongly resisted in some United States circles ever since. Once Wilson arrived, however, he found rivalries and conflicting claims previously submerged. He worked mostly at trying to influence both the French, led by Georges Clemenceau, and the British, led by David Lloyd George, in their treatment of Germany and its allies in Europe and the former Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. Wilson's attempts to gain acceptance of his 14 points ultimately failed. France and Britain each refused to adopt specific points as well as certain core principles. Several of the 14 points conflicted with the desires of European powers. The United States did not consider it fair or warranted that Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles declared Germany solely responsible for the war. The United States did not sign peace treaties with the Central Powers until 1921 under President Warren Harding, when separate documents were signed with Germany, Austria, and Hungary respectively. In the Middle East, negotiations were complicated by competing aims and claims and the new mandate system. The United States expressed a hope to establish a more liberal and diplomatic world, as stated in the 14 points, in which democracy, sovereignty, liberty, and self-determination would be respected. France and Britain, on the other hand, already controlled empires through which they wielded power over their subjects around the world and aspired to maintain and expand their colonial power rather than relinquish it. In light of the previously secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, and following the adoption of the mandate system on the Arab provinces of the former Ottoman Empire, the conference heard statements from competing Zionists and Arabs. Wilson then recommended an international commission of inquiry to ascertain the wishes of the local inhabitants. The idea, first accepted by Great Britain and France, was later rejected, but became the purely American King Crane Commission, which toured all Syria and Palestine during the summer of 1919, taking statements and sampling opinion. Its report, presented to Wilson, was kept secret from the public until the New York Times broke the story in December 1922. A pro-Zionist joint resolution on Palestine was passed by the United States Congress in September 1922. France and Britain tried to appease Wilson by consenting to the establishment of his League of Nations. However, because isolationist sentiment in the United States was strong, and because some of the articles in the League Charter conflicted with the U.S. Constitution, the United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles or joined the League that Wilson had helped to create to further peace by diplomacy rather than war, and the conditions that can breed peace. Part 8. Greek Approach. Greek Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos took part in the conference as Greece's chief representative. Wilson was said to have placed Venizelos first for personal ability among all delegates in Paris. Venizelos proposed Greek expansion in Thrace and Asia Minor, which had been part of the defeated Kingdom of Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, northern Epirus, Imbros, and Tenedos for the realization of the Megali idea. He also reached the Venizelos-Titoni Agreement with the Italians on the cession of the Dodecanese, apart from Rhodes, to Greece. For the Pontic Greeks, he proposed a common Pontic-Armenian state. As a liberal politician, Venizelos was a strong supporter of the 14 points and the League of Nations. Part 9. Chinese Approach. The Chinese delegation was led by Liu Zhengxiang, who was accompanied by Wellington Koo and Cao Rulin. Koo demanded Germany's concessions on Shandong be returned to China. He also called for an end to imperialist institutions, such as extraterritoriality, legation guards, and foreign leaseholds. Despite American support and the ostensible spirit of self-determination, the Western powers refused his claims but instead transferred the German concessions to Japan. That sparked widespread student protests in China on the 4th of May, later known as the May 4th movement, which eventually pressured the government into refusing to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Thus, the Chinese delegation at the conference was the only one not to sign the treaty at the signing ceremony. Part 10. Other Nations Approach. All Russian government, whites. While Russia was formally excluded from the conference, although it had fought against the Central Powers for 3 years. However, the Russian Provincial Council, chaired by Prince Lvov, the successor to the Russian Constituent Assembly and the political arm of the Russian White Movement, attended the conference and was represented by the former Tsarist minister Sergei Sazonov, who, if the Tsar had not been overthrown, would most likely have attended the conference anyway. The council maintained the position of an indivisible Russia, but some were prepared to negotiate over the loss of Poland and Finland. The Council suggested all matters relating to territorial claims or demands for autonomy within the former Russian Empire be referred to a new all-Russian Constituent Assembly. Baltic States. Delegations from the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, led respectively by John Paska, Jānis Čakste, and Augustinas Voldemaras, also participated in the conference and successfully achieved international recognition of the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Ukraine had its best opportunity to win recognition and support from foreign powers at the conference. At a meeting of the Big Five on the 16th of January, Lloyd George called Ukrainian leader Simon Petliura, 1874 to 1926, an adventurer and dismissed Ukraine as an anti-Bolshevik stronghold. Sir Eyre Crowe, British Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, spoke against a union of East Galicia and Poland. The British cabinet never decided whether to support a united or dismembered Russia. The United States was sympathetic to a strong, united Russia as a counterpoise to Japan, but Britain feared a threat to India. Petliura appointed Count Tishkevich as his representative to the Vatican, and Pope Benedict XV recognized Ukrainian independence, but Ukraine was effectively ignored. Belarus. A delegation of the Belarusian Democratic Republic under Prime Minister Anon Vučić also participated in the conference and attempted to gain international recognition of the independence of Belarus. On the way to the conference, the delegation was received by Czechoslovak President Tomáš Masaryk in Prague. During the conference, Vučić had meetings with the exiled foreign minister of Admiral Alexander Kolchak's Russian government, Sergei Sazonov, and Polish Prime Minister Ignacy Jan Paderewski. Minority rights. At the insistence of Wilson, the Big Four required Poland to sign a treaty on 28 June 1919 that guaranteed minority rights in the new nation. Poland signed under protest and made little effort to enforce the specified rights for Germans, Jews, Ukrainians, and other minorities. Similar treaties were signed by Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, Greece, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria, and later by Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Estonia had already given cultural autonomy to minorities in its Declaration of Independence. Finland and Germany were not asked to sign a minority treaty. In Poland, the key provisions were to become fundamental laws, which would override any national legal codes or legislation. The new country pledged to assure full and complete protection of life and liberty to all individuals, without distinction of birth, nationality, language, race, or religion. Freedom of religion was guaranteed to everyone. Most residents were given citizenship, but there was considerable ambiguity on who was covered. The treaty guaranteed basic civil, political, and cultural rights and required all citizens to be equal before the law and enjoy identical rights of citizens and workers. Polish was to be the national language, but the treaty provided for minority languages to be freely used privately, in commerce, in religion, in the press, at public meetings, and before all courts. Minorities were to be permitted to establish and control at their own expense private charities, churches, social institutions, and schools, without interference from the government, which was required to set up German-language public schools in districts that had been German before the war. All education above the primary level was to be conducted exclusively in the national language. Article 12 was the enforcement clause and gave the Council of the League of Nations the responsibility to monitor and enforce the treaties. Caucasus. The three South Caucasian republics of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and the mountainous Republic of the Northern Caucasus all sent a delegation to the conference. Their attempts to gain protection from threats posed by the ongoing Russian Civil War largely failed, since none of the major powers was interested in taking a mandate over the Caucasian territories. After a series of delays, the three South Caucasian countries ultimately gained de facto recognition from the Supreme Council of the Allied Powers, but only after all European troops had been withdrawn from the Caucasus, except for a British contingent in Batumi. Georgia was recognized de facto on the 12th of January 1920, followed by Azerbaijan the same day, and Armenia on the 19th of January 1920. The Allied leaders decided to limit their assistance to the Caucasian republics to the supply of arms, munitions, and food. The Armenian delegation included Avedis Aharonian, Hamo Ohanjanian, and Armen Garo. The Azerbaijani mission was headed by Alimardan Topchubashev and included Mahmad Hassan Hajinsky, Akbar Aga Sheikhul Islamov, Ahmed Ağaoğlu, and Mohammad Amin Rasulzadeh, first president of Azerbaijan Democratic Republic. The Georgian delegation included Nikolai Chkheidze, Irakli Tsereteli, and Zurab Avalishvili, Korea. After a failed attempt by the Korean National Association to send a three-man delegation to Paris, a delegation of Koreans from China and Hawaii made it there. It included a representative from the Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai, Kim Kyu-sik. They were aided by the Chinese, who were eager for the opportunity to embarrass Japan at the international forum. Several top Chinese leaders at the time, including Sun Yat-sen, told U.S. diplomats that the conference should take up the question of Korean independence. However, the Chinese, already locked in a struggle against the Japanese, could do little else for Korea. Other than China, no nation took the Koreans seriously at the conference because it already had the status of a Japanese colony. The failure of Korean nationalists to gain support from the conference ended their hopes of foreign support. Palestine. After the conference's decision to separate the former Arab provinces from the Ottoman Empire and to apply the new mandate system to them, the World Zionist Organization submitted its draft resolutions for consideration by the conference. The February 1919 statement included the following main points: recognition of Jewish title over the land, a declaration of the borders, significantly larger than in the prior Sykes-Picot Agreement, and League of Nations sovereignty under British mandate. An offshoot of the conference was convened at San Remo in 1920, leading to the creation of the Mandate for Palestine, which was to come into force in 1923. Assyrians. Up to 300,000 Assyrians lost their lives during the Assyrian genocide in the years before the conference. Several delegations of Assyrians participated to fulfill wishes of a free Assyria. The delegations came from different parts of the world. Syriac Orthodox Bishop of Syria, Afram Barsoum, b. 1887, later Patriarch of the Church, has often been depicted as a leader of the Assyro-Chaldean delegation. An Assyrian delegation from the United States was also present, representing the Assyrian National Association in America. A delegation from Constantinople represented the Assyro-Chaldean National Council, formed in 1919 after Syriac Orthodox, Chaldean Catholics and Syriac Catholics had united and declared their basic political and national unity under the Assyro-Chaldean name. There was also one delegation from Caucasia and one from Persia. Aromanians. During the peace conference, a delegation of Aromanians participated in order to fulfill autonomous wishes for the Aromanian people in the same vein as the Samarina Republic attempt 2 years earlier, but failed to accomplish any recognition for the self-rule desires of their people. Part 11. Women's Approach. An unprecedented aspect of the conference was concerted pressure brought to bear on delegates by a committee of women who sought to establish and entrench women's fundamental social, economic, and political rights, such as that of suffrage, within the peace framework. Although they were denied seats at the Paris conference, the leadership of Marguerite de Witt Schlumberger, the president of the French Union for Women's Suffrage, caused an Inter-Allied Women's Conference, IAWC, to be convened, which met from the 10th of February to 10th of April 1919. The IAWC lobbied Wilson and then also the other delegates of the Paris conference to admit women to its committees, and it was successful in achieving a hearing from the conference's commissions for international labor legislation and then the League of Nations Commission. One key and concrete outcome of the IAWC's work was Article 7 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. All positions under or in connection with the League, including the Secretariat, shall be open equally to men and women. More generally, the IAWC placed the issue of women's rights at the center of the New World Order that was established in Paris. Part 12. Historical Assessments. The remaking of the world map at the conferences gave birth to a number of critical, conflict-prone contradictions internationally that would become some of the causes of World War II. The British historian Eric Hobsbawm claimed, "No equally systematic attempt has been made before or since, in Europe or anywhere else, to redraw the political map on national lines." The logical implication of trying to create a continent neatly divided into coherent territorial states, each inhabited by separate ethnically and linguistically homogeneous population, was the mass expulsion or extermination of minorities. Such was and is the reductio ad absurdum of nationalism in its territorial version, although this was not fully demonstrated until the 1940s. Hobsbawm and other left-wing historians have argued that Wilson's 14 points, particularly the principle of self-determination, were measures that were primarily against the Bolsheviks and designed, by playing the nationalist card, to tame the revolutionary fever that was sweeping across Europe in the wake of the October Revolution and the end of the war. The first Western reaction to the Bolsheviks' appeal to the peoples to make peace, and their publication of the secret treaties in which the Allies had carved up Europe among themselves, had been President Wilson's 14 points, which played the nationalist card against Lenin's international appeal. A zone of small nation-states was to form a sort of quarantine belt against the red virus. The establishment of new small nation-states along Wilsonian lines, though far from eliminating national conflicts in the zone of revolutions, diminished the scope for Bolshevik revolution. That indeed had been the intention of the Allied peacemakers. The right-wing historian John Lewis Gaddis agreed. When Woodrow Wilson made the principle of self-determination one of his 14 points, his intent had been to undercut the appeal of Bolshevism. That view has a long history and can be summarized by Ray Stannard Baker's famous remark, "Paris cannot be understood without Moscow." The British historian Anthony Lenton viewed Lloyd George's role in Paris as a major success. Unrivaled as a negotiator, he had powerful combative instincts and indomitable determinism, and succeeded through charm, insight, resourcefulness, and simple pugnacity. Although sympathetic to France's desires to keep Germany under control, he did much to prevent the French from gaining power, attempted to extract Britain from the Anglo-French Entente, inserted the war guilt clause, and maintained a liberal and realist view of the post-war world. By doing so, he managed to consolidate power over the House of Commons, secured his power base, expanded the empire, and sought a European balance of power.